Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Rob. Sorry for the technical difficulties. For those of you who on Zoom, I tend to wander a little bit. I'm going to try to stay close to the podium here so you can hear me. Yeah, and so thanks for coming out. So my name's John Wallace. I'm the extension weed specialist for field and forage crops here, and I thought it would be a good opportunity this fall to share a little bit with you about a new USDA funded project that's taking place at Rock Springs at the agronomy farm. We call that Project ROSE, which stands for the Reduced-tillage Organic Systems Experiment. And I'm really sharing this information on behalf of a large team. It's a multi-disciplinary effort. And so I'm going to take the time during today's talk to recognize some of the folks that are working on this project, as well as maybe introducing you to some new folks who are working on the project. It's also a project that builds on really sustained research in this area for the past 20 years. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to also kind of look back and share with you what we've learned in the past and how that informs what we're doing right now. And so there's some new faces. There's also some people who have participated in this project throughout. I know Mary Barberchek, I think, is online. She's been here through the duration, as well as a few others. And so the common thread that connects all this, our work and the previous work, is it's really about identifying opportunities as well as developing practices or tactics to reduce the intensity and frequency of tillage in organic production systems. And so this is really one of the primary sustainability challenges for this type of production system. Tillage plays an important role, has played an important role historically. In organic production systems, we use tillage in order to incorporate residues, to amend soils with organic amendments or green manures. So it plays an important role in building soil fertility and maintaining nutrient balance. Tillage also plays an important role in pest management. We use tillage to bury weed seeds in the soil. We use it to break up green bridges that might result in crop diseases. We use it to break up insect pest cycles or refuge or habitat of insect pests. And so that level of tillage that's necessary to maintain those production systems potentially comes at a cost to soil health. We can quibble about that term. I'm using that term to capture all the soil building processes, whether it's production of organic matter or soil structure, as well as soil conservation, right? So we're really trying to make these systems less susceptible to soil erosion loss. And so a little bit of kind of, I'm a weed scientist, so the weed angle here is weed control in these types of tillage-based systems where we're using mechanical methods of weed control, really soil disturbance to control weeds, is one of the real challenges for producers. So weeds are kind of the pests that come to the top as far as really primary pest management challenges. And it's challenging because we're using tools like this flex-tine weeder at crop emergence or inter-row cultivation or in-row cultivation. And all these tools require some knowledge to make these tools effective. They require some knowledge about the science behind it, as well as kind of there's an art to cultivation. And there's a good bit of luck in any given year about how effective you can be with these tools. And the reason why is because you really need weather conditions to kind of line up to make these tools effective. If we miss that period really early in a weed's life cycle from germination through crop emergence, when we can be effective with these tools, if we miss that window because of weather or other labor constraints, we're facing an uphill battle to really control weeds in these types of systems. And so one of the reasons why I find value in doing weed research in cropping systems experiments, as well as in these low input organic systems, is because organic growers, because of these weed control challenges, really emphasize designing crop rotations around weed management principles in order to use crop rotations to break up weed life cycles. And that practice often kind of gets masked in conventional systems and plays a more prominent role in organic systems. And so, a sustainable weed management system looks like one in which you have a weed community that is low in density and high in diversity. And the way we get that is through using diverse crops that have different life cycles. And because they have different life cycles, our management interventions occur at different times, all right? And that prevents adaptive weed species in those systems. And our management tools differ. The efficacy of those tools differ, the timing of the management differs. And so we're able to break up weed life cycles. And so there's a lot of kind of possibilities in how you can design a crop rotation to effectively manage weeds, which is really exciting. I wanted to mention we have a lot of crop diversity in Pennsylvania, and in part that's due to the presence of our dairy systems. All right, so we have perennial crops in rotation with annual crops. So this picture is of a small dairy farm, maybe a 40 or 50 cow dairy with about 150 acres in crops in the Penn Valley, and you're looking at maybe a 40-acre parcel that contains 4 different crops in close proximity, 3 different life cycles, a perennial, a winter annual, and 2 summer annuals. And those will be rotated across a 6-year crop rotation. All right, so that in the background, you see the annual crops, which after 3 years of perennial crop production, if that alfalfa pays, it'll be rotated back into annual crops. So we have the diversity in Pennsylvania that make organic production practices work from a weed management standpoint. But there's also some potential challenges if we look at kind of macroeconomic factors in Pennsylvania. So in the past 5 or 6 years, you've probably seen in the news that consumer trends are changing. We're seeing declining consumer demand for fluid milk products, all right? And that's impacting our small local dairy systems. There's been a lot of efforts by the Department of Ag and state resources to support those dairy producers through tough economic times, but we've also pointed out potential opportunities for diversification for making those types of production systems more viable into the future if those consumer trends persist. And so one of those diversification opportunities is to transition to organic crop production, all right, and to capture those more premium prices, and which might be able to make a good living and have a viable production system and still on 150 acres or 200-acre farm. The other thing is that makes this kind of a viable diversification strategy is that southeastern Pennsylvania and parts of central Pennsylvania are an organic hotspot. There's been some really interesting research that's been done at Penn State by Ted Janicki, who's an agricultural economist, identifying hotspots throughout the country where there's a lot of economic activity when it comes to organic livestock production or organic crop production. And that research that was conducted demonstrates the importance of those industries for regional economies. And it also identifies some characteristics of why those places occur, because they don't necessarily occur in areas that are also just generally agricultural hotspots. And so some of the key characteristics are the presence of a support industry. Are you close to organic certification specialists? In Pennsylvania, we have Pennsylvania Certified Organic, which is a large certification company, as well as kind of support industries, crop consultants, and we also have that presence in Pennsylvania. We have very active NGOs, the Rodale Institute, PASA, are actively engaging with these types of growers. And so the other kind of macroeconomic factor is that we're seeing a pretty dramatic increase in demand for organic livestock products, and that's really being driven by the demand for organic poultry products. And domestic supply of organic grains necessary to feed those animals are not keeping up, the supply is not keeping up with the demand. And so this figure goes out to 2016, and you can see that up until that point, the supply was pretty stagnant. In the past 5 years, that has changed a little bit. In 2016, we were importing about 70% of organic grain for corn and soybeans. In 2020, we are only now importing about 17% of organic corn. So the rest is coming up through, coming from domestic sources. But we're still importing about 70% of organic soybeans. And so right now in Pennsylvania, we have large poultry producers. We have some that are targeting organic markets. Bell and Evans is a poultry producer based in Lebanon County, has just invested $500 million to really support organic grain production so that they can source their grains domestically. They've partnered with Cargill, a large grain supplier, as well as Rodale Institute, which is based in Eastern Pennsylvania, to provide those consulting services to hopefully transition about 50,000 acres of conventional grain production to organic. Right now in Rodale's transition program, they have about 69 organic grain farms in Pennsylvania that are in that organic transition program. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an idea about the activity in this area. So this was kind of the dynamics that were going on when we wrote our last grant that got funded. And so we were kind of thinking about, in light of these potential kind of shifts in kind of organic grain production, what might crop rotations look like if we see conventional grain farmers transition to organic in order to capture those premiums? What would their rotation look like? And so we actually conducted a survey, a mailed survey this past year in January. We sent it out to over 400 organic grain producers in Pennsylvania. We got a great response rate, about 25%. So we have about 110 mailed surveys that we got back. And so that's a little bit of data you're looking at. And so in keeping with what we think might occur, this data suggests that the more recent growers that are transitioning, that might be conventional grain producers that are thinking that this is a market opportunity to transition to organic, are probably more likely to use a short rotation that might look like their conventional rotation. Okay. And we have data that shows that the long-term organic producers are more likely to use a much longer rotation, 6, 7, 8 years. Our data also, our survey also asked about tillage practices for those producers. And so you can see we are very much, these are tillage intensive systems, and the most intensive part of those systems are corn and soybean production. All right, so right now, out of those 100 plus growers that we surveyed, about 90% are using the moldboard plow or inversion tillage as the primary tool before corn, and about 2/3 of those growers are using inversion tillage before soybeans. All right, so if we see shorter rotations and an emphasis on and kind of intensification of organic grain production, you're looking at potentially more intensive tillage practices. So this is also kind of an opportunity, right? We could potentially see increased adoption of what we call organic rotational no-till practices. And so this is a suite of practices that has been developed over the past 15 or 20 years. Penn State has been pretty influential in developing best management practices around this. And so I'm just going to share a little bit about those practices and what we've learned, kind of about the adoption constraints. So the first thing to note is I'm calling these organic rotational no-till practices. We are no-till planting corn and soybeans. This is not a continuous no-till system. We're finding opportunities within the rotation to decrease the intensity of tillage that's being used. So I'm just using soybeans as an example. Here, this picture is taken in early May, where that left side of the field has been plowed down in preparation for soybean production. The right side, we've planted cereal rye, and we've allowed that cereal rye to grow to anthesis. And we then terminate cereal rye with a roller crimper. All right, so it's a mechanical form of termination that doesn't require herbicides. It's really critical to time this specifically to that anthesis stage in order to get really effective termination using this method. And what we do then is create a mat in order to plant into. And that cereal rye mulch, in this case, or no-till planting soybeans into that rolled crimped mulch. And that mulch forms the primary basis for weed suppression during that crop production season. There's been a lot of component research and a lot of research that's demonstrated that total biomass production from that cover crop is strongly and positively correlated to the level of weed suppression that you can expect to get. Okay. Now, achieving that level of total biomass production in a particular location or in a particular year is challenging, right? We don't always get the biomass production that we want. And so there's been work at Penn State and elsewhere that has developed kind of integrated tactics that we can use in this type of system, including high residue cultivation. So this is Tosh, my technician, running through no-till organic soybeans with the high residue cultivator. It's a low form of disturbance. You can still control some weeds, but also maintaining that surface residue on the surface. Okay, so we've done a lot of research around this at Penn State. Several other institutions have developed practices around both organic no-till soybean production as well as no-till corn production. And we've this is a type of practice that receives a lot of publicity, right? I think everybody has probably at least heard about this method, but our survey data suggests that adoption rates are extremely low, despite that this practice has been around now for maybe 10 to 15 years. So out of 104 corn producers, only 4% are using no-till practices. That's 38 soybean producers, 8%. I'll do the math for you. That means 3 Pennsylvania growers are using no-till practices in corn and soybean. So obviously there's a reason why adoption rates are low. There's some challenges to making this system work. And our cropping systems research that was conducted in rows kind of in the previous experiments helps kind of demonstrate, and was kind of some of the first research to demonstrate some of the kind of rotational cropping system implications for this practice. How can we fit this practice into a rotation and keep it viable? And so what our research demonstrated was that some of the yield limiting factors are achieving good soybean populations. So planting into that level of residue can be challenging. Early on, it was limited by planter technologies. Planter technologies for planting into this level of residue are improving. So I think that's something that will eventually be overcome. And so that's a positive. Our research also showed that weeds, weeds is definitely a potentially yield limiting factor. We can lower weed abundance or improve weed suppression with integrated tactics. But importantly, our research showed that the level of weed suppression that we get is not necessarily directly correlated to the level of biomass, which was kind of the previously held thought. And I can talk more about that. In another cropping systems experiment, the most recent one that was conducted at this site, we compared kind of this practice using what we thought were the best management practices to tillage-based organic soybean production. And after controlling for kind of differences in weed suppression levels across those systems, as well as differences in soybean stands, we still found that there was yield drag in these no-till systems. So on average, we saw about a 4 bushel per acre yield drag in no-till soybean production compared to tillage-based soybean production. You may think that that's pretty small, but right now, soybean growers in Pennsylvania are contracting organic soybeans for $30 per bushel, right? So that's $120 gross with that 4 bushel increase. And even though we can decrease some labor and energy by reducing the number of passes with the no-till approach, we're still not kind of netting the same as tillage-based approaches. The other thing that our research demonstrated is that regardless of the biomass level that you achieve, that we can very quickly select for adapted species in this system. We have selected during the course of our research. We are now kind of a weed community that's dominated by early season summer annual species. And our biggest driver of weed right now is giant foxtail. Importantly, what the data in the top right-hand corner also shows is that due to the lack of effective termination with the roller crimper, you can start to have volunteer cover crop issues. Right, so these are annual cover crops that we're using to supply to develop that mulch system. But if we don't terminate them effectively, they end up becoming a significant weed issue as a volunteer. So as far as addressing some of those adoption constraints, again, I mentioned we think that planter technologies are improving. We've made some improvements to our system. And so we're having better luck as far as increasing kind of stand establishments or getting a full stand of soybeans when we plant them to these high resident cover crops. But really, some of the, I think the real challenges to really adoption is how we fit this sequence into crop rotations. A lot of folks who talk about this suggest that we really need to establish cereal rye very early or late summer in August or September. And that's a spot in the rotation that requires a certain preceding crop. You almost always have to come after oats or a winter cereal crop. If you don't have a market for oats or wheat, then you don't have a real fit for this rotational sequence, this mental rotational sequence. And so what we're trying to do, Laurel Wellman, who is sitting in the back, is an English master's student in my program, and we're trying to develop better cultural tactics for increasing cereal rye establishment and productivity in those later or shorter growing season windows. So Laurel was just out this past week. That picture, I think, was maybe from Tuesday, installing some experiments that are going to focus on improving kind of the no-till soybean system in that type of rotation. We see similar challenges in no-till corn. And so I guess, Rob, how late are we going to go? Right?
We have at least 10 minutes.
Okay. So in organic no-till corn, we use the same type of management tactics, but we're proceeding corn typically with a grass legume mixture. In the past, we've used hairy vetch as the legume. It's a high biomass producer in combination with the winter cereal. In this case, it's triticale. And so our previous research has shown that, again, corn yields are limited by populations. You have to be able to get a good stand established in that level of residue. And when we compared these no-till practices to tillage-based practices, we've seen a pretty consistent yield drag, more significant than soybeans. So sometimes 30 up to 40% yield drags relative to tillage-based organic corn production. And so some work that was done in Jason Hayes' lab in the past experiment identified that it's very likely one of the reasons why we're seeing some of these yield drags is due to asynchronous nitrogen supply relative to corn demand. And that's because of some of the particular kind of management constraints of this system. We're applying more in the fall ahead of the cover crop. That makes there's a potential for nitrogen leaching then in the fall. The mineralization of those legume grass mixtures when left on the surface is perhaps slower, or is slower than when we incorporate those legumes. So that's just a little bit about some of the kind of persistent constraints to adoption for these no-till practices. We certainly think that with some manipulation and some kind of improvements that the soybean, no-till soybean phase could be a viable management practice. We also have kind of pulled organic no-till corn out of our experiments. We think that due to lack of grower interest, some of these issues with nitrogen fertility, as well as some issues with growers not being real excited about managing volunteer hairy vetch in their system, that we kind of need to redesign that approach. Okay, so now I just want to introduce what we're doing now on the next cropping systems experiment. We're just finishing up our first crop year. And we really framed the experiment around 3 integrated research and extension objectives. And we framed the questions around how soil health changes across the tillage intensity gradient. Okay, and so at Rock Springs, where we have this cropping systems experiment, we designed 3 rotations that differ in kind of strategies for reducing tillage. And we've done that in a way that kind of forms this gradient of tillage intensity. Okay. And so we're going to compare those 3 systems to a perennial alfalfa 2-year alfalfa benchmark. And the way we do that, so in this kind of most intensive tillage system, which we're calling the standard, where we're still using inversion tillage ahead of the summer cash crops, corn and soybeans. We're trying to look for opportunities to reduce the amount of tillage for establishing other crops within that rotation. We're really relying on relay cover cropping practices to do that. So we're doing things like interseeding cover crops into corn. Then we would transition to soybean. Because of the types of cover crops that we're using to interseed, we need to use tillage ahead of soybean. All right, but we're eliminating the use of tillage in order to establish that cover crop. So that's what that looks when it works well. That's annual ryegrass that was interseeded in corn. The following spring, we'd be going to soybeans after plowing that down. We're also relay cover cropping in the small grain phase. So here you're looking at winter wheat that's about ready to harvest. And in the understory, you can see red clover that was underseeded in February or early March. And we are now then drilling cereal rye into that underseeded cover crop in the fall in order to create a better cover crop mixture that has corn that we think is going to have a better carbon and nitrogen ratio ahead of corn. In the shallow till systems, what we're trying to do is we're trying to integrate cover cropping practices that are not high residue and are capable of being terminated and incorporated with very low intensity tillage. All right, and so an example of that is after small grains, we're using cover crop mixture that's performed well in the cover crop cocktails experiment. It's a 3 species mixture that has 2 winter kill cover crops in it. And so in the spring, we think that we can use something like a high-speed disc at a depth of about 2 inches in order to incorporate that cover crop. So that's just an example of how we're thinking about coupling the cover crop management tactics with the intensity of tillage needed to either establish or incorporate them. Yeah, and so we have never had a perennial in these experiments before, and so we now have established, each year we'll establish alfalfa, so we'll be able to compare at the end what some of the soil health metrics look like in our annual phase compared to a benchmark 3-year perennial phase. We'll be able to look at seed bank dynamics in those annual systems compared to seed bank density and composition in the perennial phase. And so a little bit about the types of assessments we're doing. Again, this is a multidisciplinary project. We're taking kind of a broad look at the impacts of these different types of practices. In the past, we've taken a number of different soil health metrics, physical, biological, chemical control indicators, or chemical indicators. One thing that we have not done in the past is really tried to pinpoint what these practices are doing as far as potential soil erosion loss. Very hard to measure. We have a postdoc, Maria Delinky, that started in my lab this past spring, who's been developing some methodology in order to be able to make at least some relative assessments about erosion potential between different suites of practices. We're very excited to have Adriana Williams, who is a field crop plant pathologist and is also an agronomy extension educator in Center County, who's participating in our project. In the past, these projects have been pretty focused on weeds and insect pests, and we have not had a disease component. This really rounds out kind of the pest management complex within our project. And so she's been actively monitoring for different crop diseases. Mary Barbachek's lab, that includes Christy Bortman and Imtiaz Ahmad, are very involved and are taking a whole host of different assessments and that's looking at early season insect pests, late season insect pests, predatory arthropods that can provide some level of biocontrol within these systems. And so she has a very active research program within Rose. My lab's, of course, looking at the weed dynamics. We're looking at weed control levels, but as well, the other thing that we're really interested in is kind of identifying seed bank trajectories and looking at seed bank density as well as composition. Charlie White is helping us out with kind of nutrient management. So we're using poultry litter as our organic amendment in these systems. Previously, we were using liquid dairy manures. And so Charlie's been helping with figuring out those nutrient budgets. We also have an economist on the project that will help us put together some enterprise budgets and look at those differences in net returns between these different types of practices. Sarah Cornelise is participating. She's in the ag economics department. And so the second objective is realizing that, you know, our three systems are very unique to us, and this is very common among the organic production systems. And you can find no two rotations that look exactly alike. And so Franklin Egan, who's the education director at PASA, is about 3 or 4 years into a soil health benchmark study, which is this citizen science-based project that has growers actively sampling their fields and getting soil health tests done. And Franklin is capturing a lot of data about what their practices look like. He's really been focused on living cover. How long do they have living cover in the rotation? What is the tillage intensity? What level of off-farm inputs are being contributed? And so we're working with Franklin to expand his soil health benchmark study to 30 organic green farms in this project. We're trying to identify a range of producers that kind of span that tillage intensity gradient that we're trying to explore in our cropping systems experiment. We're also trying to capture that data about what does their rotation length look like, as well as what is the grain intensity, how much grain are they producing on these farms? Is that an indicator of some of the soil health indicators? And then finally, some of the same farms that are participating in the soil health benchmark study, but are also part of our advisory board, we have the extension agronomy team, the organics sub-team, very involved in this project. Christy Borelli has been leading a series of 3 case studies where we've identified farms that are using these different types of tactics. Some that are trying the rotational no-till approach, a farm that's trying to use low intensity tillage, a farm that really tries to use perennial forages in the rotation, and kind of doing a deep dive about what are the socioeconomic kind of factors that drive those decision making, as well as how they do, what they see the benefit of those rotation practices are. Okay, so just in summary, kind of the research goals of this project. We think because of this multi-criteria assessment or this multidisciplinary approach, that we should be able to identify some novel insights into the relationships between tillage intensity, some of these soil health indicators that growers care about, as well as conservation practices that they're using to really determine whether sustainable intensification or organic greens is really viable in Pennsylvania. And again, we are kind of really trying to connect this work on station with what's going on out in Pennsylvania. There are active regional organic grower networks that meet each winter, and they basically just talk shop. And we're trying to integrate our projects with those types of kind of peer-to-peer learning networks that we see in Pennsylvania. Okay, I'm sorry I went fast. I want to leave the acknowledgements up here. Again, just a number of people involved in this project. A few folks maybe I should mention, Tosh Mazzoni, who any picture you saw with the tractor was probably either Tosh or Jared, who have been doing a lot of the field operations. And so very appreciative of their help and as well as the broad team. So with that, I'll take the question too if we have time. Rosie Bradley.
I'm just curious how the yield has been next year. Change in your.
Yeah, well, we just harvested corn, but we don't know the numbers yet because we got to run we're going to correct for the soil for grain moisture. Our corn, we had a pretty good corn year, but we had a lot of disease and a lot of insect pest issues, which was common across Pennsylvania, not just and across Rock Springs. But as far as nitrogen supply of the corn, it looked good. We had good stands, pretty happy with the varieties that we're using. We're once again weedy in soybeans, which, you know, it kills me as a wheat scientist to have the weediest field at Rock Springs, but this is the name of science.
White field.
That's true.
Not the one that has a current herbicide pile, but the one that he's going to go with.
Sure, yeah. That means that your soybeans are cleaner than mine. Yeah.
With the missile system, you have a delay in germination rate with like soybean based on soil temperatures.
Yeah.
And other genotypes of soybean that can germinate earlier to potentially want to get.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was about kind of a delay in soybean germination and growth early season because we're planting into cooler soils and that's an issue. We thought that would be a bigger issue, but because we have to wait so late for anthesis, which is going to be kind of the end of May, so typically soil temperatures are kind of where they need to be to plant soybeans. But we do see sometimes delay in phenological development of soybeans when they're coming through that mulch. We now have Adriana participating, and she was pulling some plants early and looking at roots and thinking that there might be some issues related to early season diseases. We're thinking we might investigate that more. It may have been due to just the wet spring that we had, right? So that system is going to retain a lot of soil moisture at the surface, and that could be an issue. Yeah.
I'm curious, having a sneak peek about the soil health.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So I didn't do a good job of kind of my fake hypothesis figure is really based on what Franklin had shared with us earlier. So his kind of data set that he's working off of for the past 3 or 4 years has mostly focused on vegetable farms. And what he found was a pretty weak, perhaps negative, but weak correlation between tillage intensity and soil health indicators. And so that's why I had that very, you know, a large scatter and a lot of variation around that. What he's finding is that, at least in those systems, the addition of organic amendments, long in vegetable systems, we have long windows to pick cover crops. So there's a lot of biomass production from cover crops. So for farms that are actively cover cropping, bringing on off-farm amendments, that they can have soil health scores that are similar to no-till producers. You know, obviously, one of the things that isn't really measured in those Cornell soil health scores is soil erosion potential, right? And so that's kind of something that we're trying to do a better job of at least addressing.
Let's see, questions in the chat.
So that soil health thing, not taking into account like aggregate size, like macro.
Sure, I mean, so there would be some indicators so things like soil aggregate stability would be kind of indirect indicators.
This quarter not do that.
It is a part of the, yeah, it is a part of the if you get the broad.
Well, thank you, John. Quite the challenge, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's not supposed to be so hard.
Yeah.
So the problem was, actually, there were so many problems, I can't really tell you how many. So,
I mean, you've been here before, right?
yeah, we have. So John couldn't get it at his email, so he couldn't get at the Zoom link,
Oh, I see.
right? And so then I tried to log in with mine, but Duo wouldn't let me log into the
I see.
Zoom
So it
link.
was sort of a unique situation. It was
Yeah, it was just one of those, like, everything was going wrong today for some reason.
all right. Well, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah.